3, 2.
Good afternoon. I now call to order the September 19th, 2022 meeting of the Policy Review Committee of the Board of Education of Baltimore County. In accordance with Board Policy 8311, the chair of a committee at their discretion and after consultation with the staff liaison may convene an in-person committee meeting. Otherwise, all committee meetings will be held electronically. Today's Policy Review Committee meeting is being held virtually and broadcast through Microsoft Teams Live on the BCPS website. To conduct this meeting by virtual means, all voting items this afternoon will be done by a roll call vote. Board members will say their names before making and seconding a motion as applicable, as well as when requesting discussion on an agenda item. Additionally, as a courtesy to the committee, I ask that you inform Ms. Wash, Ms. Pitts, or Ms. Howie if you must leave the call by using the Teams chat feature so that a quorum can be maintained. Ms. Pitts, please call the roll to determine the presence of the quorum of the committee.
Thank you. Good evening. Ms. Causey. Dr. Hager.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Henn.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Hassan.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Rowe.
Present.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Thank you. Ms. Pitts, will you call the names of staff members to confirm attendance?
Yes, ma'am. Paul Taylor. Elizabeth Becker.
Present.
Thank you. Merrill Plate.
Present.
Thank you, sir. Pete Dixit. Dr. Yarborough. Vicky Wash.
Here.
Thank you. Jim Corns.
Present.
Thank you. And Ms. Howie.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first item on the agenda is the Ethics Code Policies, new COMAR provision, Policy 8360, Policy 8362, Policy 8363, and Policy 8364. Ms. Howie, please proceed.
Thank you. Good evening, members of the committee. At your last meeting, these items were postponed to this meeting. There was a brief presentation done, but I will not spend an inordinate amount of time this evening. I'll just summarize that these changes are being recommended for 3 reasons. First, because of legislation during the 2021 legislative session, and because the State Ethics Commission has written to every local board of education in the state, indicating that as a result of these changes in legislation, changes need to be made to our policies. The policies for which the changes are being made based upon those 2 pieces of legislation are 8360, 8362, 8363, and 8364. There's also a change being recommended, number 2, to 8360, based on changes during the last legislative session to the election law, and that has to do with the definition of contribution. And finally, there's a change being recommended to Policy 8364, based on the Public Works recommendation on page 25 of that report. And that change is to include, as individuals required to file a financial disclosure, the title of Deputy Superintendent, since we now have one. Those are the 3 very broad summaries of the changes that are being recommended. There is a chart that has been posted to board docs. It's a PowerPoint, 3 PowerPoint slides that again visually give to you the reasons for the changes and the references in statute. I'm available to answer any questions.
Committee members, other questions?
Yes, Ms. Rowe, this is Ms. Henn.
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Henn.
Thank you. Ms. Howie, at some point, policy 8364 originally had specified titles and then had changed, I believe, to a specific title and above, perhaps executive director and above, and then had reverted back to titles. And I'm concerned about going to titles, although we're adding deputy superintendent, because also one of the public works recommendations specified, or it talked about inconsistent use of titles or positions. And I know that there have been several changes and maybe more changes to come. And I would hate to put something in place that would need to be continuously kept up to date with our titles. And my concern is that it would not be kept up to date. So do you have any thoughts on that or a recommendation with regards to use of specific titles here? Thank you, ma'am.
Sure, no problem. So my recollection is that there have always been titles in the policy. The policy also permits the ethics panel to indicate if there are additional individuals who need to be added. So one of the titles, for example, that is in the policy that looks a little bit unusual has to do with under subsection 14 and subsection 20. Subsection 14, which references the MBE consultant, those were added as a result of an audit report that indicated that individuals in the purchasing office, even though they may not have control over any sort of budget, would have control over whether or not individuals receive contracts, individual vendors receive contracts. You also have, as I hesitate to say catch-all, but I do think that that's an appropriate way to look at this, subsection B21, any other employees who have the authority to make the final decision to commit the school system to the expenditure of public funds, and as I indicated, any other employees so designated by the board as periodic review would suggest, and that is subsection 22. So there is some breadth in the policy itself. As you indicated, we are, and you've heard this from me for many years, Ms. Henn, we're hesitant to bring changes to policy because of the number of, the amount of time it takes to get policies changed, but not to have titles listed, I think would err in the wrong direction.
Thank you. And I may be thinking of another place where we went back and forth with using titles versus not. So thank you for that clarification. I may have other questions, Ms. Rowe, but if somebody else would like to proceed.
Committee members, are there other questions? I don't see any others. Julie, you can proceed with more questions if you have them.
I had another question. It may not be specific to 8364, but it was with regards to disclosure of financial conflicts of interest. And it was raised at the end of the last committee meeting by Mrs. Causey about the availability of information on companies that the school system does business with and the concern regarding the availability of that information and the completeness of that information and the need to address that in the policy.
So if there is a recommendation the committee has, certainly that's something the committee can discuss. But the policy itself, as well as the model policy from the state, doesn't reference, let's say, other documents, and certainly doesn't permit a filer to indicate that I didn't know that this company was a wholly owned subsidiary of another company, for example. I wasn't aware of that. But filers can amend statements, certainly, and certainly if there's something in the statement that that an individual filer is not sure of, that is something that can be placed in the statement. I'm in looking at other LEA's policies, and I did rather recently just to make sure that the analysis was updated. I did not see any other reference to outside information, as it were, to verify whether or not certain companies or certain vendors that did business with the school system, whether or not there was some way to reference documents that the individual filers would have access to. It doesn't mean that it can't be placed in the policy, but I would remind the committee that the policies under your ethics code, the 8360 policies, even once they are amended and taken through the board through first and second reader, they still have to be approved by the State Ethics Commission. So the State Ethics Commission has the final word on whether or not our policies are consistent with the public ethics law. And as I mentioned briefly last month, I wanted to make sure going into last month's meeting that our changes were consistent with what the State Ethics Commission expected, and did get preliminary approval, or a thumbs up, if you will, from the State Ethics Commission Council, because I did not want to recommend changes that then would only not be acceptable to the commission. So just wanted to make sure the committee was aware of that.
Thank you. And to clarify, doing business with is defined in 8360, although it's referenced in 8364 and perhaps some of the other policies as well. So I wanted to provide that clarification. It's in a few of our policies. And again, the concern was not having access to a complete list and the expectation of disclosure, and whether or not someone could realistically be 100% compliant with that if we are not providing that complete list, or directions on where to find that. Because as Mrs. Causey raised, and I share her concern, where is that information? Where could someone check to ensure that? And in another section of 8364, it talks about disclosure of real interest in any entity, regardless of whether or not that entity does business with the school system. Perhaps we want to go even farther and say, disclose all employment interests, regardless of whether or not that entity does business with the school system, to err on the side of caution if we need to do that, because otherwise, you mentioned catch-alls. I don't know that there is a list, and if there is such a list, Mrs. Causey was asking, where is that, and where do we provide instructions to filers on where to find it?
So my recollection is that there is a Spotlight on Spend list that is published. It was required by state legislation, actually, specifically in Baltimore County, as I recall. So, and I believe it is live again. I can certainly verify that.
And that system is no longer online.
I beg
Yeah,
pardon?
Ms. Howard, could you verify the currency of that? Because my understanding is that the General Assembly rescinded the requirement in other legislation, and that what existed is extraordinarily out of date by years.
I will
That's-
verify.
That is correct, Ms. Rowe. They changed the requirement and weakened it in terms of what is required, and the Spotlight on Spend system is no longer online. And if you read the language in our policy, it is broader. The definition of doing business with is more inclusive or broader than the Spotlight on Spend vendors. For example, number 2, being subject to the authority of the board or school system. Number 3, being registered as a lobbyist under board policy 8365. And 4, pursuing commercial financial transactions with the board or the school system. None of those are vendors.
Actually, 4 is coming out. That's
Oh,
bracketed
sorry.
language.
So
That's
2 and
okay.
3 would not be included on the vendor list on Spotlight when it was up, and it no longer is.
Even when Spotlight on Spend was up and was current, it was at least 3 to 6 months behind at any given point in time. Because even though the General Assembly had required it, they didn't require when it should be updated.
And it was 18 months behind. You're right.
Yeah.
So what's the committee's pleasure with
That the
respect to the
school
language?
system produce a list.
So, and again, it's the committee's policy to recommend to the full board. My thought is that it is unlikely that while you are attempting to make sure that you're providing accurate information so that you can file, I'm not sure that the panel or ultimately the State Ethics Commission is going to eliminate the responsibility of the filer, notwithstanding deficient records or records that are not complete that are available to the filer. So just so you know, that may not give you the relief that you're seeking.
I think part of the problem right now is there are no records available to the filer.
I'm not sure that that is accurate, but I
We have a
will
list of
verify.
vendors.
I believe we do, but I will verify.
Okay,
And I see there's a question from Dr. Hager, ma'am.
Dr. Hager.
I guess I'm struggling a little bit with this because this is not how my world works. You know, I have a single employer and so it's pretty straightforward. But it does seem to me that the responsibility really should be on the filer, similar to what Ms. Howley was saying. And I get that not knowing what you need to disclose can be complicated, but so I guess I don't quite understand why folks can't just disclose the individuals with which they're doing business on their forms instead of waiting to see, well, who's the county doing business with, so who do I have to disclose? I guess is that the hang up here?
So, okay, so Aaron, maybe it would help if, so some people own their own businesses. And in owning their own businesses, they may have confidentiality agreements in which they are not allowed to disclose that a person is or isn't their client. In which case, if they were forced to disclose that, they might not have that client. They might actually just drop that client. So like, I have my own consulting business. I can take clients or not take clients. And I disclosed who my one client is because the client has no difficulty with that. But if I took a client who didn't want anyone to know they were outsourcing anything, then I would want to know before I took the client if they were doing business with the school system. And I'd want to be able to confirm that just beyond if they told me. So when you have your own business and you're consulting and you're doing different things like that, having a list in knowing who's doing business with the school system matters. So when I got the roof on my house replaced, I made sure to the best of my ability that I did not hire someone who is doing business in school construction because I just didn't want to have any overlap at all. So having that list available and knowing who is doing business with the school system becomes the thing that you use when you're going into business decisions prior to ever having to file a disclosure form, because it matters. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. I mean, we're not the only government entity in the state. So what's the standard practice though? So do other school systems provide a list? You know, what happens to the county government? I mean, what is the typical approach for this?
So, Dr. Hager, when I was doing my most recent research, admittedly, I did not look for that specific item, but I do not recall that there are links that a filer can access. But again, admittedly, I did not specifically search based on that kind of those kinds of parameters. So if is the committee's pleasure that there be something in the policy? Is there, would the committee want a request to the ethics review panel? Something can be placed on the website, because that is certainly more fluid than changing your policy. That is also something that can be done, and you can also ask the panel to place something in their instructions, again, without having to change your policy. So those are all options that you have.
What do you all want?
Ms. Rowe, this is Ms. Causey.
Go ahead, Ms. Causey.
Good afternoon and thank you. I had called in. I've been on the call for some time because my board laptop is not accepting the Wi-Fi where I am. And also somehow my phone couldn't log into the Teams. There's something saying about the server. In any case, to contribute to this conversation, I had a couple questions and I wanted to dovetail with Ms. Rowe. There's also a requirement of a financial disclosure statement that one provides information about their mortgage or a loan that they would have if that mortgage company or bank also does business with the school system. So if one were involved in residential real estate or commercial real estate and might have a number of loans, business loans, or mortgages with financial institutions, then it would have to be known in advance of filling out a complete ethics financial disclosure statement, which of those financial institutions did business with the school system. So in addition to professional or business situations, as Ms. Rowe pointed out, there's also an other need. And I don't believe that that referencing back to the ethics review panel is helpful, because ethics review panel does not have authority over the finance department of the school system. That's under the purview of the superintendent. And as the secretary treasurer of the board, the superintendent should be able to provide documentation that's necessary to the community at large, so that filers have that as a reference. And I think that should be in policy, that the responsibility and authority to have that information available is the jurisdiction of the superintendent. And to Dr. Hager's point about who else manages this, Baltimore County has instituted recently something that they call something checkbook, where anyone from the public can go online and see literally the to whom checks were written, what amount, and so forth. So in terms of Ms. Howie or someone from the superintendent's office or fiscal services being helpful, perhaps they could look and see what the county is doing. And as Dr. Hager said, what are other jurisdictions, school system jurisdictions doing? The questions I have specifically are, was the model policy provided to the policy review committee? Because I don't see that in board docs. Also, what was the date that the ethics financial disclosure statement, what's the most recent date that it has been updated? And it is my understanding that there is no current written process for amending ethics financial disclosure statements, and the only instructions are on the ethics financial disclosure statement. So I think we need some more addition to the policy to address that all of these things are going to be very clear and functional.
So let me address some of your questions. Some of them I can't address because they're not policy issues. With respect to whether or not the model policy was provided, I do not believe we did. It is, but the statutes were provided, as well as COMAR was provided to the committee. If that's something committee wants, that is not a problem. As to a written process for amending, I am not sure what the panel does as far as amending statements. To speak from personal experience, when I did have to amend, I simply sent another statement to the ethics review panel and indicated this is amending. There was information that I had not updated about my mortgage. So there was not any particular instruction that was provided to me. I simply gave them a cover letter and said this was an amendment. But to the best of my knowledge, as someone who does file, I'm not aware of whether or not there are instructions. I certainly have not seen one. As to whether or not there is a procedure that the panel has passed, again, I haven't seen anything on their website. And I think that was your last question, ma'am. Was there another question?
When was the last update to the ethics financial disclosure statement, and should they be considering another one given updates to the law?
So they will be considering updates based on the statute and obviously based on your policies, but the statute and COMAR, but can't consider any sort of changes until you change the policy. So this is something that should be moving forward. If there are changes specifically that you want to see in policy that then get reflected in the financial disclosure statements. I'm not aware that any changes have been implemented recently to the form. Again, speaking not from a research point of view, but from the point of view of someone who's filed for several years.
I think my own preference would be, I would like to see it in policy that the school system, whether that's the superintendent as the secretary treasurer of the board, which is probably the most logical idea, that the school system produce and publish a list of people currently doing business with the school system, and that they maintain that list as current.
So Ms. Rowe, I agree. I think something should be in policy. I'm also wondering if these policies, these draft policies have been reviewed by the board counsel, who does work with the ethics review panel, and that because I don't feel it's the most efficient process for board members to craft legal language to put in policy. So perhaps the thing to do is to have the board counsel look over it with the questions that have been raised and the points that have been raised, and draft language to put into the policy. And Madam Chair, Ms. Rowe, I would also, could you make it a standing request to have any model policies also provided to the committee and board docs?
They
Sure,
are,
Ms.
ma'am.
Howie, is that a problem?
The model policies that are in the analyses are provided to members of the committee. Everything that is referenced in the policy analyses is provided to members of the committee.
I think the outcome that I would like to see is something specified in policy that requires a list, but then something more granular that also requires that the list has to stay available for the different periods. So if we save financial disclosure forms for 4 years and the list is updated quarterly, then you need to see a PDF of the list for each quarter for the 4 years that people have forms, because your financial disclosure form for a particular time period is specific to that particular 1 year time period. So even really, it doesn't even have to be quarterly, just produce the list in January so that people have from January to April to look at that list, and that list encompasses the previous year.
Understood.
Ms. Rowe, this is Ms. Hen.
Yes, go
I
ahead.
agree. And in terms of areas of responsibility, I do think this would fall then to the ethics review panel to ensure that the documents are retained according to what you said.
So like a
So-
list in the website that gets updated
Yes.
all the time. So let's say I had to amend like let's say I had to amend something for the first year I was on the board. Going to something live on the website that's currently current right now doesn't tell me what was current 4 years ago.
Right. We're following. I'm following.
Right.
Yep.
And I don't even think it needs to be all that technologically complicated. A PDF of a list of companies for a 1-year period for each year is sufficient for the purpose.
And all we need is for policy changes then is a reference to that list. We don't need the procedure. We just need the reference.
So Ms. Howie, if you could suggest
Yes, ma'am.
language and where that language should go that produces this outcome, I think that's what we're looking for from staff.
Understood. So I realize, given the time and what is on the agenda, you have not discussed the other policies that are being brought forward. Were there changes that the committee wished to see to the other policies that are being brought forward?
I'm sorry, Ms. Howie, a child walked in. Could you just repeat that last part?
Surely. Were there changes to any of the other policies that the committee wished to see?
Committee members? Okay, hearing none. So Ms. Howie, are you going to work on that language and then bring this back at the next PRC? Is that the plan?
Surely. Does that mean that the other policies are moving forward?
Committee members, which policy is being retained?
I would think that would be 8364, since that's financial disclosure statements.
Okay, so committee members, is there any objection to moving 8360, 8362, and 8363 forward to the full board?
Ms. Rowe,
Hearing none. I'm sorry,
Ms.
say
Rowe.
that again? Yes,
this is Ms. Causey. For policy 8363, down at the page 6, paragraph 12, it says retaliation. A school official may not retaliate against an individual for reporting or participating in an investigation of a potential violation of the board's ethics code policies.
That is correct, ma'am. It's required by the new statute.
Okay, I think it would be helpful to put to define individual, that individual includes school officials.
So I'm not sure what problem you're trying to solve, ma'am.
Well, for instance, there's been situations where, well, honestly, I have felt retaliated against as a board member and did not feel that there was a specific process or policy that.
Ms. Rowe, point of order.
yes, can we not
Beyond top
discuss
of the
personal and yeah, this is not the place for specific situations to be discussed. And I think the legal definition of individual is pretty clear. I haven't read Black's Law Dictionary recently, but an individual is an individual. Any person is an individual. I'm sure it doesn't include dogs or mice or people, things, animals, but every person is an individual. So I don't think that we need to have a definition for individual that includes like what everyone with the Homo sapien genius, like what would that definition even look like? individual is a pretty plainly used word to encompass all people, including like someone who's not even affiliated with the school system who reports something like, you know, just a random community member is an individual. Ms. Howie, do you think that's accurate?
I think it is, and this is the language that is recommended in the model policy, and this is what's in the statute.
Okay, all right, so is there any
Oh,
objection
Thank you, Ms.
to
Rowe.
moving those three
I'm
policies?
looking, but I can't see the model policy.
Okay,
Yes.
I can't help that. If the preparation was there, it's been up on board docs.
No,
I know that you're using
I'm
your
on Board
phone.
Docs. I'm calling in on my iPhone, and
I
I'm in
understand
Board
that.
Docs on my personal laptop because that's open to the public. And what I'm saying is, in the policy analysis that was referenced, I don't see a link to the model policy.
You are
And I'm
accurate,
being
Ms. Crossy. The model policy was not provided to the members of the committee, but I can certainly make sure that you have the model policy as well.
Okay, so
Thank you.
since
Ms.
there,
Rowe, is that something that can be a standing process for?
yeah,
this
Ms.
committee?
Howie, if you would include the model policy links in the analysis moving forward, that I think that would be something the committee would like to see.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so is there any objection to moving forward 8360, 8362, and 8363?
I'm
right.
going to abstain because I would like to see the.
Well,
model
okay, so
policy.
there's one objection, so that means we're going to actually take a vote. Is there a motion to move 8360, 8362, and 8363 to the full board?
So moved, Hager.
Is there a second?
Luzon.
Okay, Miss, what's the name,
Fitz.
Miss Sally? Miss Fitz, would you
Fitz.
please call the roll for this vote?
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Causey? Dr. Hager?
Yes.
Ms. Hen?
No, I'd like to wait to see the model policy.
Ms. Hassan?
Yes.
And Ms. Rowe?
Yes.
We have 3 in favor, 1 against, and 1 abstained.
Okay, so the motion carries and those 3 policies will be moved forward to the full board. The next item on the agenda is policy 7330, capital projects funded by private donation. And presenting is Mr. Merrill Platt. Go ahead, Mr. Platt.
Thank you. Pete, did you want to present?
Yes, good afternoon. I'll just refresh committee's memory that this policy was presented to this committee on February 22nd. And there were recommendations made by PRC to make some changes. I will read the changes and then request your approval. On page 1, line 37, the committee recommended that instead of who submit capital project proposal, to change it to including specific donor information, donor type, whether unit of government, nonprofit organization, business, community group, PTA individuals, etc., type of donations, funds, donation in kind, donations of service, etc. On page 2, line 4, item 4, satisfactory completion of the capital project with appropriate school system management and oversight. On page 2, line 7, at the end of this statement, the board directs the superintendent to implement this policy. The superintendent will provide semi-annual report to the board on the implementation of policy and superintendent rule regarding approval process and project completions. Those changes have been incorporated in the version presented to you, and we are requesting that this be forwarded to the full board.
Committee members, are there any questions? Hearing none, is there any objections?
Ms. Rowe?
Yes.
The changes that Mr. Dixit just mentioned didn't seem to line up with the version in board docs. Am I wrong? I was trying to follow along and I don't know if anyone else.
Ms. Holly, can you check that?
7330, right?
It is 7330, yes.
Maybe I had.
Make sure you have board docs open for today's committee meeting.
Yeah. I agree with everything Mr. Dixon said. I just didn't, I maybe I had the wrong thing open. Sorry.
So you can move forward the policy with the understanding that these changes, if they have not been made, they will be made.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so committee members, is there any objection to moving 7330 forward to the full board as amended with the changes cited by Mr. Dixit? Hearing no objections, policy 7330 is moved forward as amended to the full board. The next policy that we have is policy 1300, use of school facilities. Presenting is Ms. Becker. Ms. Becker, please proceed.
So Ms. Becker is part of my team and she will support me. I'll be presenting this policy 1300.
Okay.
This policy was also shared with the PRC meeting on May 23rd, 2022. And the changes that were suggested by the committee have been included in the new version. If you want, I can read those changes, or you can just trust me that they have been made. In the interest of time, I suggest that you accept what I'm saying. I'll be more than glad to read it if you want me to, Ms. Rowe.
Committee members, do you need the changes to be read?
Yes, please.
Yes, would you read the changes, please?
So the changes, paragraph 1A, page 2, line 12, was amended by deleting for the purpose of and moving the remaining language from paragraph 1A to paragraph 3G by deleting for community purposes from line 9 and by replacing the use of school facilities for cultural, civic, educational, recreational, and charitable purposes is a long-standing practice. This was to be removed, and the new language is the board encourages the use of school facilities for community purposes, including but not limited to the presentation and discussion of public questions, public speaking, lectures, and other civic, educational, social, or recreational purposes, or church-affiliated civic purposes, and adding partisan political organization with at least 10% of the vote cast in Maryland in the last general election may use facilities for meetings that relate to the election of a candidate for public office. Item 2, paragraph 4, page 2, was amended by inserting the superintendent shall provide quarterly reports to the board of refusals of facility requests with reasons for those refusals. Now, the first item, there were 4 favor and 2 against, and the second item, there were 6 members and all of them were in favor. Ms. Rowe, I'd like to read a statement as something that staff would like for you to know. We believe in supporting our communities and providing the best environment for our students to learn and thrive. Some of the newly incorporated items in the policy may seem to be minor changes to the board or this committee, but these changes are a radical departure from the past. These changes have the potential of increasing the use of facilities request well beyond the current 80,000 requests that our staff reviews each year and for which we provide services. In an environment of tight fiscal constraints, scarcity of labor to maintain facilities and building system, the facilities management team is concerned about the facilities being compromised and not being readily available for student staff on the next day. The item that is being proposed would extend the use of building systems beyond the present scheduling and the increased need of maintaining old infrastructure, cleaning and sanitary environment with the current staffing is a challenge. In light of that, our team does not recommend supporting these changes. Thank you.
Committee members, are there questions or other feedback?
Ms. Rowe, this is Ms. Causey.
Go ahead, Ms.
And-
Causey.
In the policy analysis for 1,300 use of school facilities, there were two recommendations discussing relevant public works recommendations, and there's a paragraph titled current changes proposed, and then there is another paragraph entitled background PRC action that spoke to additional amendments that were made by the committee to policy 1300. And I would ask for clarification for Mr. Dixit, where are the changes that he was reading? Are those the background from PRC, or those were the additional ones proposed? And do the additions align with the law? And then when I would like to know specifically which were considered radical by staff, and also what staff specifically were speaking to this. Was it OPE case or which? Just to understand the perspective.
So it's a long question. I'll get to the specific issue that staff is concerned about, and that has to do the adding of partisan political organization with at least 10% of the vote cast in Maryland in the last general election may use school facilities for meetings that relate to election of a candidate for public office. The second piece that is in there is about the recreational church affiliated civic purposes. So policy seems to be advocating, and you have the right to do so, advocating more use by religious organization, more use by political organization. We are staffed currently solely for educational purposes, and our team believes that opening this may potentially increase the number of requests beyond what we can reasonably handle and may compromise our ability to provide a well-maintained, clean environment for our students. So we are recommending that this not be added. But if you as committee decide that this is in the interest of school system, after listening to what we have to say, we'll abide by your recommendations, your policy.
So I have a couple comments on that subject, and then Aaron will take your question. But so the church affiliated and the partisan groups having access, one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that the community has access to our school facilities through rec councils. And there are ways to get a permit to use a school facility through a rec council. And then the rec council and the county rec staff take responsibility for cleaning, et cetera. And so I don't have a problem with removing those groups from our policy and removing the school system from the direct intervention with that, because we have a shared use agreement with the county that allows rec councils, and rec councils have the ability to facilitate any number of permit requests. And anytime I've used a school facility for some civic purpose of different things, it's been through the rec council permit. So I think that removing the church and partisan political stuff from our from this language is appropriate, but it's also appropriate because we're going to get into some pretty bizarre things with separation of church and state, and the fact that we're a nonpartisan school system. And in the way our political system is set up right now, I don't know how much security we'd have to have on premises if, like, for instance, we had some really controversial speaker at an organization, and then a whole bunch of protesters to protest the speaker show up, and a whole bunch of protesters to protest the protesters protesting the speaker show up. And then you get into this whole controversy because maybe the school system denied the request because we don't have the security to actually secure the event. And so, yeah, I think churches and partisan politics have to go. That's my personal opinion. Dr. Hager?
I share the concern that Mr. Dixit stated, and you as well, Ms. Rowe. However, I remember having this conversation last time, and I believe I was convinced, at least, that we had to have this specific language based on state law. I remember looking at the website and being shocked at the way that the wording was, but I thought that this was a requirement that we have this exact language in our policy. So I don't know if Ms. Howie or someone could comment on that.
Ms. Howie, could you speak to that, please? You're muted, ma'am.
The language that concerning a partisan political organization is in state statute. That is, as I recall, that's an exact quote that the committee asked be placed in the statute or in the policy.
So how does the statute read, Ms. Howie? Are we mandated to do this, or is it an option that we can or we don't have to?
It's an option, but if you give me a moment, I will double check the statute.
And while she's looking that up, I recall looking at it as well. And so if we are able to remove it, yeah, I would also support that. But if it is a requirement, that I felt, at least in February, that our hands were tied. So I could be wrong, though.
Ms. Rowe,
Yes.
I have a different opinion on this.
Go ahead, share your opinion while we're
and
waiting for Ms. Howie.
Mine is an issue of equity. I view our schools as the only facilities available to some communities and as suitable meeting places, and believe they should be available to as many groups as possible, to all groups. And in the absence of other suitable facilities, that we should be as open as we can be, whether that's for partisan political groups, religious groups. They are used as community facilities now, like you said, through rec councils. And if we were to exclude this from our policy, then it would leave communities who have no other suitable facilities without meeting places. And for that reason, I support keeping that in the policy.
I don't believe it does, because they can use the very same facility. They just have to go through the rec council, who's the administrator of a lot of the permits. just let them go through the rec council to do that. And so that our staff aren't overburdened with all that. And so that our staff doesn't have to provide staff and security for the event. So it's not like they can't use the facility now. They just have to go through the local rec council that's charged with permitting for that facility and to make sure that it doesn't conflict with other rec events, etc. But the thing that comes along with that is then the county provides security and cleanup and everything for the event. And the rec council has insurance to cover the facility. And, you know, I'm not saying that people can't use facilities or can't access them, but they just need to go through the rec council to get the permit and follow county rules through our county shared use agreement.
So if I may finish my thought, that rather than put up barriers to access a community resource, and in terms of volume, there are two, according to this language, there are two primary parties, and the number of organizations for those two parties are few within any given community. Religious groups, there are more than that, of course. I just see requiring multiple hoops as a barrier. And if these are resources, these are facilities that should be available to the community, and we need to make them accessible to community members, to taxpayers, and they're like I said, in the absence of other facilities, we need to make them as accessible as possible. So for that reason, I support keeping it in. Should it become a burden on staff, we can always revisit this. However, I believe in making it open and accessible. Thank you.
Great. So Ms. Holly, is your interpretation of this law that we have the option to remove that, or is it legally required? There's a lot of language here.
So there's a lot of language, but if I'll direct your attention to subsection B, which says the county board shall provide. And then in subsection C, each county board may permit. So it's up to the county board as to the types of uses. So the discretion in C is for a partisan political organization, and in D for religious and other lawful purposes. So those two are discretionary. Subsection B is not, and that is the presentation of public questions, public speaking, lectures, other civic, educational, social, or recreational purposes, or church-affiliated civic purposes. Those are mandatory, but subsection C and D are not.
Okay, so committee members, is there a motion to follow staff's recommendation and exclude the optional component of political and religious use of facilities from this policy?
So moved, Hager.
Is there a second?
I have a question after the second.
Okay, I'll second that. Julie, your question, and we need to hurry up because we're past our agenda schedule.
I just,
And Ms. Rowe, I also had questions after.
excuse me,
Okay.
I'm asking.
Okay, if you have questions, put it in the chat, please. Go ahead, Ms. Hen.
Could Ms. Howie clarify that which is required by statute once more?
Surely, subsection B of 7108 indicates that the county board shall provide for the use of a public school facility for the presentation and discussion of public questions, public speaking, lectures, or other civic, educational, social, or recreational purposes, or church-affiliated civic purposes.
And ma'am, what is the distinction between church-affiliated civic purposes and religious purposes in your interpretation? If a church group is holding a civic discussion versus a religious service?
I think I had listened to some of the General Assembly on this, and I think it's the difference between collecting for a food pantry, running a food drive, having fundraisers for the community versus actually holding a church service. Because if you open it up to religious use, then you could potentially have people requesting to use the facilities for services.
Okay, could Ms. Howard comment?
Well, I believe some of our facilities are used for services now. And I'll defer to Mr. Plate and Ms. Becker about that. But religious or other lawful purposes seems to me to be a religious service because, again, that's what we do now, and I don't believe that is new language. The church affiliated purposes could be related to a specific church organization as opposed to our religious organization, and those are not necessarily the same.
I don't understand the distinction between
So a
a
religious organization isn't necessarily a church organization. Simply, if you talk whether or not every religious organization is a church organization, it's not.
Oh, okay. So like, for instance, like if IOCC wanted to do something, they're not a church, but they're like an international Orthodox charity. So, all right, I understand. Is there any more discussion on the motion to remove the non-mandatory language?
Yes, Ms. Rowe, this is Ms. Causey.
Ms. Causey, go ahead.
So one, out of the 80,000 requests, how many of those come through Rec Council?
So
And
I don't have that number, but I have Ms. Becker online, and I'll ask if Ms. Becker has that number, or we can get that later on.
And it doesn't have to be exact, just generally.
The majority of the use of facilities, I would say, out of all of the different organizations, Rec and Park is our largest customer.
Okay, so out of those 80,000, the majority are from Rec and Park.
Correct.
Thank
But if you need a
And-
detail, I could get that for you.
No, thank you. Also, I support including that which is approved by state law. I agree with expanding equitable access, not limiting it. And even the word church affiliated, as there are some religions that worship and it's not called a church. It's called a synagogue or a mosque or another organization. So I think that that just in and of itself is limiting, whereas the additional language is religious, and then that would be more inclusive. Also, I appreciate a recommendation to go through Rec and Parks, but as was mentioned, most of those 80, or a majority of those 80,000 are Rec and Park requests. So it's not as if it goes through Rec and Parks, it's not also going to have to go through our staff. And then I'm wondering why the related policies 3530 and 6303 are deleted from the related policy section of this draft.
Ms. Howie, do you have an answer to that question?
I do not. I will defer to the facility staff.
So I do not have answer to that either, but we can find that out.
Okay, because it sounds to me like they are relevant. Policy 3530 is safety and security, and policy 6303, emergency closures, delayed opening, and early dismissal of schools under offices, actually should be labeled Rule 6303, because there was a point when we had a policy 6303, and unfortunate, in my personal opinion, it was deleted several years ago.
So
But
can
it
we,
should be Rule 6303.
Can we return to the motion on the floor and then we can either bring this policy back next time because we have to move on?
Okay, the
So,
other thing I would point out, Ms. Rowe, about this particular motion to remove those additional reasons, that there is language already in draft policy 1300 that specifically states about refusal of the use of any facility if it appears that the use is likely to provoke or add to a public riot or a breach of the peace or create a clear and present danger to the peace and welfare of the county.
okay,
state.
sure.
So
We
there-
need to vote on the motion. The motion is to exclude the language that is not mandated by state law from the policy. It's moved and seconded. Ms. Pitts, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Causey,
No,
Dr. Hager,
Yes.
Ms. Hen,
No.
Ms. Hassan,
No.
thank you, and Ms. Rowe.
Yes. All right, the motion does not carry. So Mr. Dixit, that language will remain as is in the policy. And is there any objection to moving policy 1300 forward to the full board?
Ms. Rowe, I would ask if there's no objections to remain including policy 3530, safety and security, and to add superintendent's rule 6303.
Is there any objection to that? Okay. So with those
Members of the
additions,
committee, there is not policy 3530.
okay, so we can't add a policy that doesn't exist.
Okay, is there a policy that was rolled into? Sometimes we delete policies when they're combined.
We really need to move on. Is this worth holding up the policy for moving to the full board, or can you take this up in email as it goes to the full board? Because this is an addendum to the policy. It's not actually the content of the policy. And I'm sure once you find the appropriate policies you want added to the bottom of the policy as a cross-reference, the staff will be happy to add those. But we need to move on to the next agenda item. So I'd like to be able to get a consensus to move this to the full board. Is there any objection to moving policy 1300, use of school facilities, to the full board for approval? All right, hearing none, policy 1300 is moved to the full board. And Ms. Howie and Mr. Dixit, if you would get with Ms. Causey on what policies she'd like cross-reference and make sure they actually exist. The next policy is policy 3250, selection of design and construction consultants. Mr. Dixit, are you handling that one too?
That's correct. So I will share with you the changes that we are proposing here. It includes a statement that the school system will comply with all contract solicitation and procurement procedures for design and construction services as outlined in paragraph 5-112 of the educational article. Second change is legal references have been updated to reflect the transfer of the Interagency Commission on School Construction Regulations from COMAR 23.03 to COMAR 14.39. And third one includes implementing rule under related policies, which includes a hyperlink to the implementing superintendent's rules in board docs. And this was to respond to the Public Works recommendation 830. So with that, we are requesting your approval to proceed this policy, move this policy to the full board.
Thank you, Mr. Dixit. Committee
So-
members, are there any questions?
I'll move it, Ms. Rowe.
Is there a second? Hearing none, is there any objection to moving policy 3250, selection of design and construction consultants, forward for the full board? Hearing none, the policy is moved forward. Okay, policy 7110, determining needs. Ms. Taylor, please proceed. Mr. Taylor, sorry.
So the
Excuse me,
next
Ms. Rowe.
policy 7110, I'll be presenting to you the changes that have been incorporated in this policy. Policy is being revised to include standards of promoting student achievement by providing high quality educational facilities. Item 2, identifying the current conditions of facilities. Item 3, responding to current and projected demographics of student population. Item 4, implementing the instructional program. Item 5, incorporating input of parents, student, and staff. And item 6, making decisions to maintain, upgrade, renovate, or replace facilities. Item 7, using an equity lens when making recommendations for funding requests. And item 8 is to conform with the Policy Review Committee's editing conventions. So with these revisions, we are requesting for your approval to proceed to the full board for approval of policy 7110.
Committee members, are there any questions? Hearing none, is there any objection to moving policy 7110, determining needs, forward to the full board for approval?
Ms. Rowe, Ms. Causey is abstaining.
Okay. Okay, policy 7110 is moved forward to the full board. Ms. Phillips, please note that Ms. Causey abstained. Okay, the floor is, we're moving on to item 4, Committee General Good and Welfare.
Excuse me, Ms.
Yes.
Rowe, may other staff who are non-PRC staff be excused?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, the floor is now open to members of the committee to discuss issues of concern. I must emphasize that this is not the time to conduct business, as there has not been notice provided as required by the Open Meetings Act. At the March 14, 2022 PRC meeting, Ms. Hen's request to have this item discussed was postponed. Ms. Hen has asked that staff review policy 5550 and policy 5560 and explain which parts of the policies were required by state law or state regulation. Based upon that request, staff have provided and distributed a footnote version of these policies. Mrs. Hen, what did you wish to bring to the committee's attention?
I'm sorry, Ms. Rowe. Give me one moment, please, ma'am. I wish to bring these policies forward for review by the committee during regular business. Which we cannot discuss during this portion of the meeting. Is that correct?
So we cannot discuss what specifically, Ms. Sally? We can't discuss bringing these policies forward. We can't discuss the specific policies.
Certainly, you can't discuss business related to the policies, but if there were specific issues that Ms. Hen wishes to be placed on future agendas regarding the policies, as the committee is fully aware, these are extremely important, and the board takes these very seriously. So with respect to specific issues, if there's something that the committee wishes be focused upon, then that would at least guide your discussion. And
So,
that,
Ms. Holly, the board, this committee recently voted on a list of items and policies that we're going to review over the course of the next year. And the committee did add a number of policies. Are these two policies on that list?
I do not believe they are for 8130. If you give me a moment, I will just, actually, Ms. Wash, if you could check the 8130 list and see if these policies are included. I do not believe they are.
Because then my next question becomes, if we were to add these policies, where in the list would they get added?
That's always the question.
I don't see them.
Okay, thank you.
So are we allowed to discuss adding these items to the list somewhere in this section of the meeting? Like what is considered not a violation of the Open Meetings Act?
Well, it would be a violation of the Open Meetings Act if the public were not aware that you were discussing 5550 and 5560.
Okay, can we discuss if they should be on the agenda or not at a future one
Surely.
without actually? Okay, so
Yes.
committee members, what we're discussing is whether or not to add these two policies to the current list, and where in the order of the policies do we want these two policies added to that list to review these policies? Ms. Howie, could you display that list on a shared screen so the entire committee can see that list?
Sure, give me a moment, please.
Julie, would you like to speak to your request?
I would, thank
While
you.
she's doing that.
Sure. So these are policies that I had actually requested to be added to the list, and had thought they were coming forward along with guidance or recommendations within the legal parameters. And I've been researching this myself as well. So thank you, Ms. Howie, for providing the footnotes. And Ms. Rose quite familiar with these as well, having served on a work group that looked at these policies extensively. So this will require some time and attention of the committee to devote to this. The one thing we don't have much of, so I'm cognizant of that. But as Ms. Howie said, these are critical, particularly as of late, and I ask that we prioritize these amongst the list of policies consideration or on the committee's schedule.
So committee members, I would just like to say that my first year on the board, we did a rather extensive student discipline study on these two policies, and the policy review committee was given massive binders of information. So I think what Ms. Henn is requesting is that we go over and review that work again. But I don't know that that extensive type of review can be done the way we normally review our other policies. I think that if we're going to have that kind of review, it needs to be more of a project that we whittle away at a little at a time. Committee members, do you have comments on such a thing?
And just a moment, please. Members of the committee, the 8130 report is included in the chat, the link, but I'm asking Mr. Corns if he could please display that on the screen.
So committee members, are there any comments about should we engage in this project? And if the answer is yes, what priority should it take against this list?
Ms. Rowe, this is Ms. Causey. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. What I'm seeing is that policy 5550 has not been updated since 2019. Do I have an accurate understanding?
So yes, ma'am, that's accurate. And Ms. Henn, I do see 5550 and 5560 as added to the schedule.
Okay, thank you for that. I would support those being moved up. I think what we've heard extensively at board meetings in public comment is staff and administrators of the school system, as well as parents and even our own student members of the board in the past, the recent past, have spoken to concerns of safety, discipline, and the effect that that has on the educational environment for all learners, but also the impact that it has on staff. And so I think that it's highly relevant, and I think that it's important.
And I'm sorry, I did misspeak. 5550 was last reviewed in 2019, 5560 in 2020.
So I would just like to say that if we do decide to do this and the committee wants to do this, that I think it needs to be added somewhere in the list of policies added by the policy review committee, because all of those other policies you see that are scheduled for review were last reviewed in 2016. And we have reviewed these policies even within the term of this board. So I don't want to belabor this discussion anymore. Is there a motion to add these two policies to this list? First, let's just start there.
So moved. Ken?
Is there a second?
Members of the committee, just so you know, it's already on the list.
Oh, wait, so what are we asking, to move it up the list? I can't see the whole, hang on, where's this link? I can't see the whole list.
So
And I already have 50
during-
windows open.
So during the 21-22 school year, at the request of PRC, 5550, 5560, 8400, 8410, 8420, the audit committee charter, the audit committee charter policy were added at your request during 21-22. But those policies are now being carried over into 22-23. That is why they're not yet reviewed. You
Okay,
have
so
several
let's-
policies from that year.
All right, so let's just talk
I'd-
about,
I'd like to
Yes.
make a motion.
okay, what's your motion?
My motion is to move 5550 and 5560 to the agenda for the November PRC meeting, along with the new policy on workplace bullying.
So I'm objecting to that because we
Second.
have agendas all the
Bobby.
way out. I would like for the motion to be where on this list, because Ms. Howie, am I correct in assuming that this list that this committee and the board already passed, that we are working through the list from top to bottom? Is that correct?
We're working through the list. That is correct, actually from bottom to top.
From bottom to top. So from the bottom of policy scheduled for review, I'm reluctant to add anything based on a month, because if we say we're going to add something in the month of, then it means we're going to bump things that we have a legal requirement to review in favor of something that we have no legal requirement to review at this time. And we need to meet our legal statutory requirements before we start adding more work to the agenda, an agenda we frequently have difficulty completing. So
Mr.
I would like,
Is there a second for discussion?
I'm not even going to accept the motion. We need to adjust the list. This is the approved policies review agenda of which the agenda is formed. So if somebody wants to move that to a place on the list that will get it in November and bump things with legal statutory, someone can make that motion. But as the chair of a committee, I'm not going to prioritize something over our legal statutory requirements. So Ms. Hen, if you have a suggestion as to specifically where on this list you think you can add something that will get it in November, I don't know that we can even accurately predict what we're doing in November, because I don't know what we're going to complete in this meeting yet till it's over.
Is there a recommendation, Ms. Howie?
So I don't know that I understand exactly the depth that the committee wants to explore, which the committee wants to explore the policies. Ms. Rowe recalls, Ms. Causey recalls that there had been a few occasions when when PRC has done a deep dive into certain policies, heat being one of them, that I recall, under the direction of Romaine Williams, and religious leave being another. So it depends on the level of review the committee expects. I mean, for those policies, the committee expended special meetings or had special meetings in order to discuss them. If there are specific, if there are minor changes, obviously that's something that can be done within the scope of this meeting and these meetings. But if the committee wants to do something more, then we would have to carve out additional time just to deal with 5550 and 5560.
All right, so let's, I just want to get an idea of what the other committee members think.
So point of order.
I
Ms.
know
Rowe.
what Julie and Kathleen think. What do the rest of the committee members think? Do you want to do this? Do you want to move it up the list? Do you want to just leave it on the list? I want other people. Ms. Hassan, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So of course, I've discussed the importance of especially policies 5550, 5560, the importance of those, but I think it's also imperative to realize that these policies cannot only be amended with minor changes. And they cannot be amended, we've had, public sessions where we discuss these, and that's excellent, but I think there has to be a level of depth that I don't fully think we're all grasping. And I can say this as someone in the school building, there is not one meeting. We cannot have simply one meeting in November where we completely just fix this and say it's done. And I think that it is essential that we do create a deep dive. And of course, I want this to happen much sooner rather than later. And I would love to see that, but realistically, I would so much rather see a deep dive into policy that we can all stand behind, and in policy that guarantees the safety of our students, in policy that guarantees the well-being and the educational environment that our students deserve. So I think it's rash to say we want this policy done by November, because the reality is there's so much more work to be put in. There are so many students to listen to other than myself, because I know I talk, I know I have that, reputation of sharing my opinions, especially on these issues, but I'm also likely one of very few students from which you've heard from. So I think we can't we cannot amend policies like this until we have a deep dive on the research perspective as well as how it applies.
Okay, I agree with that. I don't think this is a minor edit thing. I think if we do it, it's a deep dive, and it means that we have meetings specifically dedicated to this deep dive so that we don't mess up the rest of our statutory requirements. Dr. Hager, what do you think?
Yeah, I was gonna, I completely agree with Mrs. Hassan, and I'm glad that it's on the list. So I feel like as far as the PRC goes, I'm okay with the current status of it being on the list. I think it would be wonderful if perhaps, Ms. Henn and Dr. Williams sat down and created and maybe in a future board meeting, we create a task force to kind of identify policy recommendations, like Ms. Hassan said, kind of a deeper dive that takes a longer time and more focused. But as far as the PRC side of things, I'm happy with kind of where we are with it being on the list, I guess.
So I think what I would like to see happen is for Ms. Henn and Ms. Howie to get together on this and actually figure out the scope of this project, and specifically how many extra meetings it would take to accomplish the scope of this project, and then bring that proposal back to the committee to vote on. Ms. Henn, is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, so
Ms. Rowe, may I make a
is there
comment,
willing? Well, I'd like to
we
respond.
do have other things on the agenda, so
Ms.
if-
Rowe, can
yes.
we see if the committee is willing to devote a special meeting or two to this? We only have a short time left with together as a board. But
Sure, but I don't think we're going to complete this work in our term on the board. I don't think it's actually even possible. I think we need to see what you have in mind and what Ms. Howie has in mind before we can Is the committee, is there anyone on the committee who would object to an extra monthly meeting specifically for this project between now and December? Which means you all have to find time to actually attend the meetings. We can't send out a Google poll or whatever and have you all say no one can attend, which is what's happened in the past.
Ms. Rowe, this is Ms. Ghazi. I would
Yes.
find time for this, but I would also suggest that Ms. Hassan be included with Ms. Hen and Ms. Howie to map out
Sure.
for that special
Anyone
meeting,
who
but
wants to
it
be
also for the
included in the
future.
sure. Anyone who feels a strong need to be included with Miss Howie and Miss Hen can be included. Miss Hassan, do you want to be included in that?
I would love to. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So Miss Hen, Miss Hassan, and Miss Howie can get together on a scope of the project and then bring that back to the next PRC meeting for approval, and with the understanding that it is going to be extra meetings. And I think that we could probably handle not more than one extra meeting a month, because it has to happen in this time frame of like 4 to 6, and there's other staff and other people that have jobs and other committee meetings to attend. So the scheduling of school system staff has been, it's not just when we're available. There's a lot of people to coordinate. All right, so let's move on. We'll do that. You guys can get together with Miss Howie. Miss Howie can put that on the next agenda for consideration. So, yes.
I have one other item of business.
No,
that-
we have to move on. We have an actual policy to talk about yet. We'll talk about the policy and then your general welfare. Why is general welfare not at the end of the meeting?
It is at the end of the meeting.
Well, wait, so
That's
what
where
is
we are
item, what is item 4B, policy 8315?
That's an update from me.
Oh, okay, so
about
it's just an
policy.
update.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
So
let's do the update because it's already 6:02, which means we're over the time for the meeting. And Julie, send me an email, or we'll put
I did.
another good in general welfare.
I did, and it's 30 seconds.
Okay, take your 30 seconds.
Ms. Howie can go first since she's on the
Okay.
agenda.
You can take your 30 seconds, but then nobody else is taking any more time to comment on whatever you say in your 30 seconds. I'm giving everyone fair notice. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Howie.
thank you. Members of the committee, an update on the litigation regarding policy 8315, which is meetings participation by the public. I informed you last month that there had not yet been a circuit court decision concerning your policy. That decision was issued on August 25th, 2022. It would, barring any further appeal, staff will proceed with reviewing policy 8315 based on the direction we received from the committee at your last meeting.
Okay, are there any questions on this update, committee members?
Just a quick question, Ms. Hallie, this is Erin here. I looked to see in the rule related to this policy, and I did not see one. And I feel like we talked about this before, so I apologize that these things keep coming up. But the list of the groups that were in effect before the 2018-2019 school year, which is what the policy says, where can we find that list?
I can provide it to you. Yeah, I can get you that list.
Yeah, I thought there would be like a rule attached to the policy. I
No,
didn't
ma'am.
see one.
And
that, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
there are very few rules in the 8,000 series. I think there are just 2. So,
I think
yeah.
you mentioned that before. And so, when are we talking about this policy then, Ms. Rowe? Is it on the list?
Well, I think we're waiting for all the litigation to be finished, and then Ms. Howie will put it on the agenda, but we can't, we need a court opinion to make the policy. So it's gonna basically, we need to wait for it to work its way through the courts.
So
at
this
point,
what
the
we just
circuit
heard was
court-
not the thing.
The circuit court did issue an opinion upholding the state board as well. And again, the appellants at this point have not yet sought Court of Special Appeals appeal. So barring any further appeal from the appellants, then staff can go forward with the recommended changes to 8315.
Okay, so are we waiting out their timeline that they have to file an appeal to see if they do?
That is one thing we're doing, but again, they have till the end of this week.
Oh, okay. So this can be put into the list somewhere. I got it. All right. So it'll be
Yes,
put
ma'am.
into the list somewhere. Okay,
Yes,
Julie Hen, 30 seconds, and then I'm doing item number 5.
You got it. So it was a year ago today that I asked that the committee consider the addition of a policy to address workplace bullying of the former committee leadership. So if there are no objections, I ask that the committee ask staff to prepare a draft workplace bullying policy based on the Montgomery County Public Schools policy and regulation, and that the policy be brought to the committee for consideration during our term on the board.
Second, Ms. Causey.
Okay, so as far as discussion, does anyone have any discussion on this?
This is Ms. Causey. I would just say that the Montgomery County policy is readily available and that it staff should be able to address this pretty easily.
Ms. Holly, is it appropriate for me to divide this question so that it's voted on, one, to actually create the draft, into the timeline for bringing it to the committee?
So that the question can be divided. I was just sitting here wondering whether or not the public had noticed that the board would, or the committee would be taking action. But yeah, the question can be divided if you so desire. It's severable.
Okay, so Ms. Pitts, let's vote first on asking staff to create a draft on that policy.
And Ms. Rowe, I didn't formulate a formal motion because I was looking for consensus, but I can
Okay.
word it as a motion.
So, all right, so is there consensus? Does anyone object to staff formulating a draft for this? Okay, so staff can formulate a draft. And then is there any consensus on where this gets added to this list of policies?
And ma'am, it is on the list of policies to be brought.
So, okay, so does the committee agree that this has to be done within our term? So before the end of November? Miss Howie, what would get bumped if we do that?
I would have to construct the list and see, ma'am. I can't say right now.
I object to putting timelines on things based on months because we're working through a list in an order of agenda items. And how quickly we work through those items to determine when we get to other things that are not statutory obligations, not bumping statutory obligations so we can put a whole bunch of other stuff on the list in place of them because the statutory obligations are boring and this other stuff is really exciting. That's my personal opinion. May
I speak?
Is there any?
to it?
You know what? No, we're past 30 seconds. Ms. Howie, add this item of discussion to the next agenda because we're adjourning this meeting. You asked for 30 seconds and you made a motion that's going to take forever to debate. So I'm postponing the motion
Point of order,
to the
may
next
we vote?
meeting. I have the right to postpone the motion to the next meeting. Someone call orders of the day immediately. See, look, I'm the chair. No one needs to. I can call orders of the day. And the orders of the day is it's past 6 o'clock. It's time to adjourn the meeting. Ms. Howie, please move this specific motion to the next agenda. And we will discuss it there. The next meeting of the Policy Review Committee is scheduled for Monday, October 17th at 4:30 p.m. Because there's no further business, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.